On the Broken Wharf podcast, James Renahan says, one of the questions that I've asked myself over the years is, which came first, believers' baptism or covenant theology? And this is kind of looking at Baptist identity today and the roots of that. And looking at the 1689 Particular Baptist podcast, they talk about here that when you start to see that covenant theology really as an identity with the particular Baptists, it's not just like a subcategory of what they teach. This is defining who they are. And it has to do with how they see baptism and how they see what the church is, their ecclesiology. And for the particular Baptists, it's all tied back to how they view their covenant theology. He says it has widespread implications. And Pascal Denault, who has wrote on this specific topic, looking at the 17th century different covenant theologies and specifically looking at the Baptists' specifics in the covenant theology, it's looking at who is part of the church and therefore who should we baptize. And he says the reason for this is covenant theology. And Pascal talks about how the early Baptists, their covenant theology was a bit different than the Westminster covenant theology, as well as the kind of John Owen subservient view, though it was tied closer to that subservient view and kind of comes out of that view. He says that the early particular Baptist rejected the one covenant of grace under two administrations, which is specific to the Westminster. He says, for the Baptists, the covenant of grace was revealed during the Old Testament time, but it was not actually a covenant. It was not in a covenant form. It was just a promise. The other covenants God made were subservient. So the Old Covenant was not the covenant of grace. And as John Owen says in talking about his specifics to the subservient covenant theology, he says that the Old Testament saints were saved under the Old Covenant, but not by virtue of the Old Covenant. Pascal says it was subservient to the covenant of grace. It was there to bring it to fulfillment. It was there to keep the promise. But it was in itself and its own substance, another covenant made with Israel, made with the people, to earthly ends, carnal ends, and using earthly kingdom, the kingdom of Israel with earthly limits, and all that was typological, and it was temporary, pointing to the new covenant, pointing to Christ. So the gospel was there, he says. It was revealed, but it was not administered directly by these covenants as the substance of the covenant of grace, being the substance of the old covenant. And in Ephesians 2, it says, remember that you were at that time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers to the covenants of promise. So everyone that was saved before the coming of the Messiah was saved in virtue of what the Messiah would do. So everyone that is saved is a member of the new covenant, even before the new covenant was made, but we don't have one covenant under two administrations like the Westminster Confession. He says what we have actually when we look at the entire Bible structure is we have two covenants. We have the old covenant that is typological of what God will do. So going back to James Renahan, he says that a profound understanding of what covenant theology is helps us not just with our identity, but with a means by which we are able to express our doctrine of believers' baptism in light of the progressive revelation that we have through the historical covenants in the Bible. So going back to that question that James Renahan asks himself, he says, which comes first, believers' baptism or covenant theology? And my answer is covenant theology begins with the Jacob Lathrop Jesse Church, and the group that develops believers' baptism comes out of that. And then you see a progression through certain writers up into the 1680s, such as Nehemiah Cox.